sleep stories for restless minds. Tonight, drift into a world where fog is more than weather, it's memory, and letters find you when you're ready to read them. In Letters Across the Fog, we follow Isla and Calder, two lifelong friends reunited in a lighthouse beyond time. Each night, they receive mysterious letters that unravel forgotten truths, lost pieces of themselves, and the beauty of simply being. This gentle, reflective story is told in a soft, wandering style, designed to lull your mind into rest and invite dreams in like old friends. 30 parts. Narration female, soft-spoken. Mood cozy, timeless, introspective. Setting a fog-shrouded lighthouse beyond time. Welcome to your quiet hour. Isla Wren had only been the fogkeeper of Winthrop's Reach for 2 weeks when the first letter appeared in the gate box. The town, small, sea-bitten, and slow to change, had no mail routes, no delivery trucks, and no official postmaster. What it did have was the fog, a thick, pearly curtain that rolled in off the coast nearly every morning, and with it strange mail that collected at the little wrought-iron gate at the end of Hollow Street. No one knew how or why the fog brought the letters. They simply accepted that it did. Just as her aunt had done before her, Isla took the small brass key from its peg by the door of the old fogkeeper's cottage and made her way down to the gate before dawn. The world smelled like sea glass and eucalyptus. Her boots were still new enough to squeak. The gate box was cold and slightly damp, as if it had been opened by the fog itself. Inside, a single envelope rested on the velvet-lined tray. No stamp, no address. Just her name, Isla, in blue ink written in a hand she didn't recognize. She took it carefully, turning it over once. No seal, no postmark, just the name and something like static in her chest. Back inside the cottage, she set the envelope on the table and made tea, lavender and peppermint, the kind her aunt used to drink. She sat in the wooden chair by the stove, letter unopened, watching the flame flicker in the kettle glass. It wasn't fear that kept her from opening it. It was something quieter, like respect. Eventually, she slid a butter knife beneath the flap and unfolded the paper inside. The letter was short. You don't know me yet, but I've known you for a long, long time. I've watched the fog roll in around your windows. You always wait until the kettle whistles. I'm still here, and if the fog allows, I'll write again. There was no name, only a symbol drawn beneath the lines, a small lighthouse, done in ink so faint she thought it might be pencil at first. She traced it with her finger, then looked out the window where the fog had just begun to thin, and where, across the bay, the old lighthouse blinked once in the pale morning. The fog didn't clear fully until midday, and even then it only lifted just enough to blur the sky into a soft silver dome. Isla stood in her garden with a mug of reheated tea and stared across the bay. The lighthouse blinked once, paused, then blinked again. It hadn't worked properly in years. She'd asked around when she moved into the cottage, and no one in town could say who maintained it. Some thought it was automated. Others said it had been disconnected entirely. The wind plays tricks, old Mr. Kettleby had said. Don't trust it. But now, in the quiet that wrapped around the garden like a shawl, Isla was sure she saw the signal again. One blink, then nothing. She walked down to the edge of town later that day. The fog had returned, thinner now, hovering low and whispering along the road like it had secrets to share. Winthrop's Reach had 2 streets and 1 row of shops. The post office had closed in 1997. Most people got their mail in town, if they wanted it at all. But the gate box still filled, always with just enough, always without return addresses. She passed by the bakery, nodded at Elsie sweeping the stoop, and made her way to the little museum next to the fishmonger's, a crooked house full of dusty photographs and rain-warped ship manifests. Inside, she found the curator asleep in a rocking chair by the window. "Margot?" Isla said gently. The woman stirred, blinking behind round glasses. "Ah, Miss Wren, I heard you'd taken up your aunt's work. Strange days for it, isn't it?" Isla smiled. "Has it ever not been strange?" "Fair point," Margot said. "What brings you in?" She showed her the letter, just the drawing at the bottom, the faint ink lighthouse. Margot leaned in, brow furrowing. Looks like the old bell. That's the one on the bluff? Isla asked. Margot nodded slowly. Hasn't been manned since '03? Some say it was condemned. Others, she trailed off. Well, they say things. What kind of things? Margot gave a knowing shrug. Ghosts. Love letters. The usual. Later, Isla stood on the beach. The fog thickened again as if summoned by thought. The tide was pulling out, gentle and long. She looked up at the bluff where the lighthouse stood, a stone silhouette in the evening hush. The wind stirred her hair, salt on her lips. And then in the fog, a second letter. Not in the gate box this time. Tucked between two stones at the edge of the shore. It read, I saw you reading. You lean your head left when you're thinking. I remember that. I remember more than I should. I'll explain if the fog allows. And beneath it, the same lighthouse. Only this time there was a name drawn beside it. Calder. The name clung to Isla like mist. She whispered it aloud as she stirred honey into her tea just to hear how it tasted. Calder. It felt older than her, heavier somehow. Not the name of a stranger exactly, but not familiar either. Like something from a dream you only half remember. A melody you used to hum without knowing the lyrics. She placed the second letter beside the first on her table. Together they felt like puzzle pieces from different puzzles that had been cut by the same hand. Outside, the lighthouse blinked again. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat wrapped in a blanket by the fireplace, reading the letters over and over. The handwriting was the same, smooth, unrushed, like the writer had all the time in the world. At dawn, she walked down to the small cafe by the dock. The fog was unusually thick, rolling in slow waves across the cobblestones. Mr. Lind, who ran the cafe, nodded at her from the counter. Something in the air this morning, he muttered. Makes your skin remember things. Isla just nodded. After a long pause, she asked, Do you know anyone named Calder? Maybe someone who used to live near the lighthouse? Mr. Lind tapped the side of his mug, thinking. Calder Reed, he said finally. Lighthouse keeper. Years back. Kept to himself. Used to hum while he worked. Do you know where he is now? Still up there, last I heard. Isla blinked. But the tower's abandoned. Mr. Lind gave her a look. Lot of things around here are abandoned, Miss Wren. Doesn't mean they're empty. That afternoon, Isla packed a basket with bread, a thermos of warm cider, and the letters. The fog had settled deep and low as she followed the winding path up the bluff, the crunch of gravel her only companion. The lighthouse grew from the mist slowly, stone and iron, tall and quiet, its windows dark, but its door just slightly ajar. She knocked once. No answer. She stepped inside. The air was damp, dusty, filled with a smell she couldn't place, like old paper and burnt salt. She climbed the narrow stairs, each creaking step feeling like it might whisper back. At the top, she found a small room, round-windowed, cluttered with books and lanterns and a single table. And on the table, a third letter. Unfolded, waiting. I wasn't sure if you'd come. I think the fog wants us to meet. I don't know how to explain it yet, but I'm glad you're here. It wasn't signed. But this time, beside the familiar lighthouse sketch, there were two figures drawn in simple ink. One with a lantern, one with a key. The third letter stayed on the table long after Isla had read it. She didn't sit down right away. She stood by the narrow window instead, looking out over the town that barely moved below. The fog pressed up against the glass like a living thing, as if it wanted to be part of the conversation. There was a lantern on the shelf, tarnished brass and thick with soot, a matchbox beside it. She lit it. The flame stuttered, then steadied. The room felt warmer, less like a ghost's nest, more like someone had just stepped away. She turned back to the letter. The drawing at the bottom, two figures, one with a lantern and one with a key, was unlike the others. Less symbolic, more expectant, like a message mid-breath. Whoever Calder was, he wanted her to come. Or the fog did. She wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. She stayed in the lighthouse for an hour, maybe 2. Time was strange in that place, softened, stretched. She found a notebook tucked into the desk drawer. It was full of sketches, ships' windows, fog banks, a tree that only appeared in 3 drawings and never had leaves. And lighthouses, pages of them. Each drawn slightly differently, each one marked with a tiny date. The oldest entry was from 30 years ago. The most recent, yesterday. She left a note of her own on the table beside the latest letter. Just a single line. I'd like to meet you too. She didn't know who would find it or how, but the fog was always listening. The next morning, the fog brought a package. It sat on the garden gate, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. No postage, no tape, just her name again, written in the same ink as the letters. Inside a set of keys. Old, iron, and labeled with a single word on a brass tag. Tomorrow. Isla turned the key over in her hand. It was cold, heavy, and old enough that the brass tag attached to it had gone a bit green at the edges. One word etched neatly on it, tomorrow. There was no other clue. No box it fit into. No lock. No note. No new letter? Just the key and the thickening fog outside her cottage window. That day passed slowly. She moved through the cottage like it wasn't fully hers, rearranged the letters on the table, tidied the edges of the rug, lit a candle, then another. She kept checking the gate box. But there was nothing new. Even the lighthouse stayed dim. That night, she left the key on her nightstand and dreamed she was walking through the fog barefoot, following the sound of footsteps that always stayed just out of reach. In the dream, the fog smelled like tea. In the dream, she didn't feel lost. At dawn, she returned to the lighthouse. The stairs creaked as always, but the air inside felt different, like someone had opened all the windows just before she arrived, letting the salt and light rush through. There was no new letter on the table, but a chair had been pulled out. And there was a mug, half full with something that still let off the ghost of steam. She didn't touch anything. She only stood there feeling that quiet hum again, that sense that something unseen was present and waiting. And then she saw it. On the far windowsill, another envelope. No name this time, just the word begin. She unfolded it with careful hands. You have the key now. That's all I needed. Tomorrow, meet me where the fog meets the fence. You'll know it when you see it. Bring the key. Don't be afraid of what you don't yet remember. I wasn't. Calder. She stayed in the tower until the fog burned away. And when she descended the stairs, the key swung gently from a chain around her neck. The fog was thick again by mid-afternoon, drifting in low and steady like someone pouring milk into a basin. Isla left the cottage wrapped in a wool coat and a silence she had not yet shaken. The key hung beneath her scarf, a small weight resting just above her heart. She passed the bakery where no one looked up, past the post where the notice board fluttered with unread announcements. She walked toward the far edge of Winthrop's reach, past the place where the road turned to gravel and the wind lost interest in direction. And then she saw it. The fence. It ran crooked and short, half swallowed by dune grass and fog. The posts were soft with moss and leaned like tired dancers. But there it was, one gate slightly open. She stood at the opening for a long moment. There was no one in sight. No lighthouse beam. No sound but the distant hush of waves and the occasional knock of wind against the dry grass. She stepped through the gate. On the other side, the landscape opened like a forgotten letter. There was a bench, weathered gray, and beside it something wrapped in fabric and set neatly on the ground. A small thermos, a second cup, a folded blanket, and a note pinned beneath a stone. Sit with me, even if I'm not there yet. The fog is slow sometimes, but it always brings me back to you. See. She sat on the bench and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The thermos smelled like cider, just like the one she had left on her own table the week before. She poured 2 cups anyway. She set one beside her, and for a long time she watched the fog drift in gentle sheets around the fence, and she waited. When the cup beside her grew cold, she didn't move it. When the fog grew thick again, she didn't rise. And when she finally stood, hours later, she found one new thing left behind beneath the bench. A small folded map, drawn in ink, marked only by fog lines and lighthouses. And at the center of it, written in Calder's hand, "Where we crossed before." The map was hand-drawn but not crude. Calder's lines were clean, deliberate, meant to last, even if the paper had begun to yellow. Isla spread it out across her table later that night, smoothing the folds with careful fingers. The town was there in the top left corner, marked only as a cluster of boxes. The lighthouse stood near the edge of the page, sketched more carefully than anything else, with waves curling around it. But what stood out most was the center of the map. There, beneath faint strokes of fog lines and looping footpaths, were 2 tiny initials, C, and beside them, in smaller handwriting, "Where we crossed before." She couldn't remember any place like it. Not in the town, not in the woods, not even during her years visiting her aunt in summers past. But the way the lines curved, the loop of trail leading into a shaded cluster of trees, felt familiar, like something she might have known once in a dream, or a past life. She traced the path with her finger. It led away from the lighthouse, beyond the dunes, into the woods behind the fence, a place the fog almost never reached. The next morning she packed a basket and set out. No letter had come overnight, but the thermos and cups from the bench were gone, cleared as if someone had gently tidied the scene after she left. The gate was still ajar. The grass bent in the direction she walked. The woods were hushed and low. The trees were thin, and their leaves whispered only occasionally, like they'd said all they needed to long ago. She followed the curve of the old trail. It was faint, moss-covered but not lost. Her boots brushed over scattered pine needles and old stones. Then she saw it. A clearing, half-ringed with lichen-covered rocks. And in the center, a bench, older than the one by the fence, worn to gray, cracked in one place, but unmistakably marked. Carved faintly into its back, in the same careful lettering as the map, "Where we crossed before." She sat. The woods were quiet, except for a single crow calling somewhere deeper in. There was no letter, no visitor, just the faintest sense, like pressure behind her ribs, that this wasn't her first time here. And then she noticed, tucked just beneath the bench, a slip of paper, folded small. She opened it slowly. We were different then, but we still found each other. I wonder what version of you this is. Calder. The note stayed tucked in Isla's pocket as she walked home. Not because she'd forgotten it, but because it felt more like a secret than the others, something private, meant to be carried rather than read again. I wonder what version of you this is. It was such a strange question. And yet she understood it. Not fully, but enough to know that Calder remembered her, not just from a place or time, but from some other shape of life, like chapters rewritten and woven together by fog. Back at the cottage, she lit a candle and laid the map beside the others. The ink was beginning to fade on the oldest letter, so she placed a piece of glass over it to protect it. There were now 4 letters, 1 drawing, 1 map, 1 key, and 1 name that felt more like a presence than a person, Calder. She wondered where he was when he wrote. Was he nearby, watching from the woods, waiting for the right version of her to arrive? Or was he further, somewhere the fog could travel but her feet couldn't follow? She didn't know. But she left the window open that night and let the mist curl in over the windowsill. In her dreams, she sat at a table in the lighthouse with someone just out of focus. He spoke without moving his lips. His voice was warm. "You always think you're the only version," he said. Then he poured her tea and added 2 sugars, just how she liked. The next morning, a letter arrived with the dew. Folded once, tucked into the doorframe. No name this time, only a drawing. 2 keys crossed like compass points. And below it, "You're getting closer. When you're ready, the fog will part for you. Until then, meet me in the pages." C. She wasn't sure what that meant until she saw the notebook. Left on her porch chair, wrapped in cloth and smelling faintly of cedar and ink. Inside sketches, entries, fragments of stories, like someone had written pieces of her life without ever meeting her. Moments she had lived, and others she hadn't, yet. The notebook's pages were thick, soft at the edges, like they'd been handled many times. The handwriting was Calder's. Some of it was neat and linear, journal-like. Other entries were scrawled sideways in the margins, circled or crossed out. Some pages were torn away entirely, the ghost of ink left behind like fading thoughts. Ella read slowly. There was no date on the first entry, just a line of text. "She asks too many questions and always leaves the tea bag in too long. I used to think that was annoying. I think I loved her for it." She turned the page. A sketch of the sea, not from the bluff, but from the bench near the crooked fence. There were footprints drawn in the sand, small and close together. A single caption beneath, "Winter version. She wears blue now." Isla blinked. That was true. This year her coat was navy. It hadn't been before. As she read, something quiet shifted inside her. The notebook was a record, not just of events, but of a Calder who had known her, maybe in another place or another version of their shared fog. Maybe this wasn't the first time they'd met. Maybe it was the first time they'd remembered. She flipped to the center of the book. Here the writing changed, tighter, almost hurried. "We lost each other once in the tide. Not time, space. Just the fog turned and I wasn't fast enough. I waited, wrote. She came back different. But I loved her anyway. Then, tell her I kept the key." Isla set the notebook on her lap, heart thudding not with fear, but recognition. She hadn't remembered losing anyone, hadn't remembered Calder before all this. But now, when she closed her eyes, she could just barely feel the echo of something, of standing on a shoreline, calling out for someone who had already turned away. She returned to the lighthouse that afternoon. No one was there, but a note was pinned to the inside of the door, held with a small seashell. "If the versions align, I'll be waiting. The fog isn't a barrier. It's a bridge. See." The lighthouse was empty, but not still. Dust floated in the sunlight, suspended like thoughts that hadn't landed yet. The lantern she had once lit sat cold on the shelf, but the notebook in her arms made the room feel warm. She sat at the table, unfolded the latest note, and whispered aloud, "The fog isn't a barrier. It's a bridge." She took out the key, still on its chain, and placed it beside her cup. It gleamed faintly in the light, the word tomorrow etched in its side, catching the sun like a wink. A thought struck her. She checked the lighthouse drawers beneath the sketchbooks and old maps. Beneath one drawer's false bottom, she found it. Another key. Older, rusted, no tag. But it had the same groove pattern, like a pear. She held both keys in her palm. Together they felt balanced, like halves. That night the fog came earlier. She returned to the bench beyond the crooked fence where the wind whispered names through the dune grass. 2 cups again. A warm thermos? And beside them a letter addressed simply, "To this version of you." She opened it slowly. "I think this time is different. You walk slower. You notice more. You've read the notebook. You didn't run. I've tried writing this ending before, but maybe it isn't one. Maybe it's a beginning. See." Isla folded the letter and held it in her lap. There were no answers in the note, but she didn't need them. She could feel Calder's presence like a tide, steady, rhythmic, close. Not in the way you feel someone standing behind you, but in the way you sense the moon pulling on the sea. Not visible, but undeniable. When she rose from the bench, the keys were still warm in her palm. And this time, when she turned toward the woods, The fog parted just enough to show a path she hadn't seen before, winding, faint, but real. She took one step, then another, and did not look back. The path behind the crooked fence was narrow and soft underfoot. Isla's boots sank just slightly into the mossy ground. The trees whispered, not in words, but in the creak of their limbs, the hush of breeze through their leaves, as if the forest was welcoming her back, or recognizing her. The fog curled in the spaces between trunks like threads of a memory that had not yet formed. She followed the trail slowly. There were markers she couldn't explain. A stone with a name smoothed away by time, a scarf caught on a branch, faded from the sun, a lantern, still unlit, hanging from a hook driven into a tree. She reached out and touched it. It was warm. Half an hour passed, maybe more. Then she came upon a clearing she hadn't seen on the map. At the center stood a small wooden structure, more of a shed than a house. Weather-worn, slanted slightly to one side, moss growing up one wall. The door stood open, and on the threshold lay a folded piece of paper, weighted down with a compass. She picked it up gently. The needle of the compass spun once, then settled. North was behind her. The note read, "We've met here before. You were laughing. I was shy. You left your glove behind. It's still here. See." She stepped inside. The interior was quiet, dust dancing in the amber light through a narrow window. Shelves lined one wall, full of old books and folded maps. A desk sat in the corner, papers scattered across it. And on the edge of the desk, a single wool glove, navy blue, finger seams just a little too long. She lifted it. It matched the coat she wore. She didn't remember ever losing it, but she slipped it on and it fit perfectly. Somewhere outside, a bird called once and then went silent. And Isla, standing in that shed of lost time, closed her eyes and whispered into the quiet, "I think I remember the laughing." The glove stayed on her hand long after she left the shed. It was slightly damp, holding the chill of old shadows and faded light. But it also felt anchoring, like the final piece of a puzzle she didn't realize was unfinished. The woods were quieter now. The fog had drawn back a little, letting slivers of sunlight through, scattering light across the trail in soft, uneven patches. She followed them. The path split not far from the shed, one trail curling back toward the lighthouse, the other leading into thicker woods she didn't recognize from the map. She paused, then took the unfamiliar path. There was something about the stillness that called to her, not ominous, just expectant. And when the trees opened again, she found a second building. Not a shed, not a house. A small glass room. Walls of misted panes, vines crawling up the edges, and at its center, one long table with chairs on either side. Inside, it smelled like lavender and old ink. A kettle sat atop a wood stove, still faintly warm. And there, on the table, another letter. "You always liked this place best. Said it reminded you of when the world was smaller and everything important could fit into one conversation. I left you tea. It's your favorite. If you don't remember yet, that's okay. You will. See." She looked to the stove again. There was indeed tea. A cup waiting. Steam curled upward like the fog's softer cousin. She sat, and when she sipped, the flavor unlocked something tucked far back in her chest. A moment of warmth and laughter, of a shared cup and a shared look across this very table. She hadn't remembered it until just then. But now it lived again. Outside the glass, the fog moved differently. Not aimless, but deliberate, as if it too remembered where it was going. The glass room felt suspended, like a thought just before it's spoken. Isla sat with her hands wrapped around the warm tea, steam rising in lazy swirls that never reached the ceiling. Outside, the fog pressed gently against the windows. It didn't feel intrusive. Just close. She finished the cup and stood. As she moved around the table, her reflection drifted across each panel of glass like a quiet twin. Then she noticed something new. A second cup had appeared, still steaming, and beside it a fresh envelope. I almost stayed that day. Do you remember? You stood in the doorway. I had my coat in hand. We were both waiting for the other to say it first. But the fog rolled in and I left too soon. Maybe this time we get to finish the conversation. See. Isla didn't remember the exact moment, but the feeling of it pressed against her chest like a familiar weight. That aching hesitation, that silence full of words neither of them had been brave enough to say. She stood there for a long time, letting the steam from both cups fill the air between them. As the light began to change, she stepped outside again. The fog had thinned, revealing not a clear sky, but stars. Not many, just a few, bright enough to catch her breath. The trail was glowing faintly with their shimmer, as if starlight had fallen and chosen to walk beside her. She followed, back past the shed, through the woods, across the familiar bench at the crooked fence. And there, hanging from the gate latch, a lantern, lit, warming the fog like a beacon, and inside it, folded carefully against the glass, "Come back tomorrow. I think I'll be able to stay." Isla barely slept. Not from worry, but from a softness that filled her like a long, slow breath held just before a smile. She kept the keys by her bed, one old, one new, one labeled tomorrow, the other anonymous, etched only with wear and time. At first light, she dressed in layers, wrapped the notebook in a scarf, and stepped out into a fog that shimmered with silver. The lantern was still lit. Its flame fluttered quietly, as though it had waited all night just for her return. She crossed the crooked fence, passing the bench, now dry from morning sun. The path remembered her, giving slightly beneath her boots, leading her forward without hesitation. When she reached the clearing, something had changed. The air felt warmer, not in temperature, but in presence. There was a stillness, yes, but beneath it a pulse. The shed's door stood open. Inside, the glove remained on the desk, but now it rested beside a folded shirt, familiar forest green, and a second notebook, thicker, older. A slip of paper poked out from the first page. She opened it. "I think I'm here. I don't know for how long, but I want to try. Calder." Her heart didn't race. It settled. The kind of quiet joy that grows slowly, like the way sun warms wood over hours, not minutes. She stepped back into the clearing. And there, leaning against a tree, arms crossed, hair a little longer than she'd expected, was Calder. Not a ghost. Not a memory. Just him. He smiled. "I was starting to think this version of you had gone somewhere else," he said. She didn't reply. She simply walked toward him and placed the key into his outstretched hand, the one labeled tomorrow. They stood beneath the same sky for the first time in what felt like forever. No wind moved. No birds called. Just the soft, shared quiet of two people who had waited for this moment without knowing exactly what it would hold. Calder turned the key over in his hand, his thumb grazing the word etched into it. "Tomorrow. Still fits," he murmured. He looked older than she remembered, but only slightly. His eyes were the same soft at the corners, like he'd spent a lifetime squinting into the sun or smiling at something he didn't dare interrupt. Isla said nothing for a while. She didn't need to. She simply walked to the bench at the edge of the clearing and sat. A beat later, Calder followed, leaving just enough space between them for the fog to thread its silver fingers. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure you were real," she replied. He laughed, quietly, kindly. They talked for a long time, though neither could later remember what was said. It wasn't about facts, not dates or places or who had written what when. It was rhythm, that soft, familiar cadence of two souls in the same current. At one point, Isla held up the second notebook. "I found this," she said. "It's yours?" He nodded. "Started it when I couldn't sleep," he said. "Turned into something else." She flipped to the middle. There, sketched lightly in pencil, were two figures on a bench, fog curling around them like thread from an unseen spool. "It's not finished," he said. "It doesn't need to be," she said. As the sun began to lower behind the trees, Calder reached into his coat and pulled out a final envelope. Unsealed? He handed it to her without a word. Inside? "This is the only version I ever wanted. See." The fog didn't part that evening. It stayed, soft, still, and for the first time, Isla didn't mind not seeing the road ahead. They didn't speak much the next morning. The fog lingered, brushing the windows of the lighthouse, and both seemed to agree without saying it, today was meant for quiet. Calder boiled tea on the old stove, the same way Isla always had. 2 cups, 1 sugar each, and a slow stir with a silver spoon worn smooth at the edge. He handed hers over wordlessly. She smiled, and they both leaned against the windowsill, watching the fog shift over the sea. "It used to scare me," Isla said eventually. "What did?" he asked. She tapped the glass. "This, the not knowing, the quiet, the way everything disappears when the fog comes in." Calder nodded, then took a long sip of tea. "And now, I think I finally understand it's not about what it hides. It's about what it holds." They took a slow walk through the clearing that afternoon, past the shed and into the woods. The old trail, the one that had once felt foreign, was now worn smooth by footsteps, hers, his, versions they might have been before. They found another note pinned to a tree. Not in Calder's handwriting. This one was hers. Folded and yellowing at the edges, it had clearly been left long ago. It read, "If you're reading this, I hope you didn't forget how to find me. If you did, just sit still. I always find my way back. Calder read it and chuckled, folding it carefully. "You always did leave breadcrumbs. Guess I didn't expect to be the one following them." Later at dusk, they sat on the bench once more. 2 cups between them, 2 notebooks, 2 versions of a story that had waited long enough. Isla leaned her head on Calder's shoulder and said, "We should write this down." He looked at her. "We already did." It had been 3 days since they found each other. 3 days of quiet tea mornings, notebook scribbles, slow walks through the woods. Each day similar to the last and yet not the same, like waves that reach the same shore but leave different patterns in the sand. Isla began noticing details she had never seen before. Carving on the bench C+I, faded but certain. The rhythm of Calder's breathing when he read silently. The way he always looked at the fog, not through it. That afternoon she returned to the glass room. The dust had settled again, but 2 chairs were pulled closer this time, and in the center of the table sat a photograph. Faded, sepia-toned. 2 children in raincoats standing by the crooked fence, fog curling around their boots like a pet. She didn't remember the moment, but the expressions were unmistakable. Hers, his. Even then, Calder arrived without a word. He looked at the photo and smiled with the side of his mouth she hadn't seen since the very first dream she'd forgotten. "I think we've done this before," he said. "Then maybe we'll do it again. Would you want that?" She thought for a long while, and finally said, "Yes, if it always ends here." They stayed until the fog turned golden with dusk. As they stood to leave, Calder paused beside the table. He pulled something from his pocket, a 3rd key. This one was different. Small, brass, no engraving. "I found it in my coat," he said. "No idea what it opens." Isla turned it over. It felt heavier than it should have. "Maybe it's not for a door," she whispered. "Maybe it's just a promise." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, neither of them wanted to open anything else. They simply wanted to stay inside the fog, inside the quiet, inside the story they had always been writing. Together. Mornings began to carry a rhythm soft as the tide. Isla woke first, not out of habit, but because she liked the sound of the lighthouse creaking with its age. She liked the feel of the blanket wrapped tight from the night's coolness, the scent of distant tea from the kitchen, and the weight of a notebook still warm from where it had rested against her dreams. Sometimes Calder was already outside, sketching the fog from memory before it disappeared. Sometimes he was asleep still, the same expression every time, like he was listening to music that hadn't written yet. This morning they made tea together. No words passed between them until she handed him his cup, and he looked down amused. "You gave me yours." She looked at the mug, slightly chipped, painted with the faded image of a lighthouse. It was always hers. He offered it back, but she shook her head. "It's all right. We've both had it 1,000 times. After breakfast, they walked the trail behind the clearing again. The fog was thinner now. It moved like an old friend, unhurried, unafraid to show its shape. They passed the shed, now gently leaning into the moss. Calder reached out and touched its frame with quiet affection. "This was where I waited," he said, "every time." She nodded, resting her palm on the opposite side of the doorway. "And I always found you here." Farther along the trail, they came across a new object. A small wooden box. No latch, just resting beneath the base of an elm tree as though it had grown there. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, blank. But when Isla held it in her hands, letters began to bloom across it, written in soft gray ink. When the story slows, it doesn't end. It breathes. Fog. Neither of them spoke. They folded the note and returned the box to the roots of the tree. Then walked on, leaving the rest of the day unwritten, at least for now. They spent the day collecting small things. Isla found a button from an old coat, smooth wooden etched faintly with initials C. R. Calder returned from the far side of the clearing with a page torn from an atlas. It showed a coastline no longer marked on any modern map, but Isla traced the shape with her finger and said without knowing why, "That's where we first spoke." Neither of them asked how she knew. It felt true. That was enough. In the lighthouse's lantern room, they placed their findings on a wide wooden shelf. A button, a map, a dried flower, a tiny bell, 2 folded notes. No labels, no explanations. A quiet museum of things that once mattered and still did. That evening, rain tapped gently against the window panes. The fog thickened, curling up to the sills like a cat. They sat on opposite ends of the same couch, Calder reading aloud from a book with no cover, his voice soft like the story had been written in the wind and borrowed just for the night. Isla stitched thread through an old linen scrap, nothing in particular, just patterns, shapes, familiar motions. Time passed like it does when you're not keeping track. Later, Calder said, "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if we'd never written the first letter?" She didn't look up. "I wonder what might have happened if we never stopped." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Maybe we didn't." There was a letter on the doorstep the next morning. Neither of them claimed to have placed it there. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Both of theirs, woven together. And the message? Just 2 words. "Still here?" The letter they found that morning, 2 simple words, "still here," stayed pinned to the lighthouse door all day. Not because they forgot it, but because they liked seeing it there. A note from the world to itself, a quiet reassurance that some stories didn't need explaining to be believed. They moved through the day slowly. Calder made soup, humming some melody neither of them could name but both recognized. Isla organized the shelf of found things, the button, the flower, the page of the forgotten coastline. Each one had no timeline, no fixed beginning or end. They were fragments that told a complete story only when looked at with closed eyes. In the afternoon, she returned to the glass room with a small satchel. She laid a letter on each chair, not to be read, just to be placed. A thank you, a promise, an echo. And on the center of the table, she left her old glove, the one from the shed, worn and now warmed by weeks of her keeping. It no longer fit quite right. But that felt appropriate. As she stepped outside, she heard a sound that stopped her. Laughter. Calder's. She followed it down the path to find him standing in the center of the trail, holding an envelope in each hand. "You've been writing behind my back," he said, mock accusation in his tone. "I thought it was your turn to find the breadcrumbs." He handed her one of the letters. It was addressed to the version of you that still forgets. Inside a single line, "You're not lost. You're just pausing." They sat together by the crooked fence as the sun set in orange streaks. Neither of them asked what tomorrow would bring. They didn't need to. Because when Calder leaned back against the post and said, "I think we're almost there," Isla only nodded. "I think we already are." The fog rolled in early that morning, not in silence, but in a hush so complete it almost felt like a song with no notes. Isla woke to its embrace, pale light slipping through the cracks in the wooden shutters. The kind of light that made everything seem paused, suspended between what was and what might be. She rose, stretched, and stepped outside barefoot, the stones cold and damp beneath her feet. Calder was already at the bench, sketchbook open, charcoal in hand. "What are you drawing?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately, just kept moving the charcoal, soft and deliberate. Finally he said, "The way the light moves now, it's different. Like it's waiting." She sat beside him, leaning in to watch the image take shape. It wasn't a place. Not exactly. More a feeling. A memory of light, the weight of silence, the way fog made everything seem new, even if it wasn't. Later, they walked to the shed, now slightly overgrown with moss and vines. They didn't go in. They simply stood outside, letting the moment stretch and fold over itself. Isla placed her hand on the doorframe again. Calder did the same. The fog pressed close. And then a sound. Not loud, not sudden. Just a chime. Soft, musical. They turned to find a wind bell hanging from a branch, one neither of them had seen before. No wind stirred it. It simply rang once, then stilled. Inside it was tucked a message, no larger than a matchbook, bound with a thread of gold. "If you're reading this, it means you've stayed long enough. Now let the fog carry the rest." They didn't speak of it. Instead, they returned to the lighthouse, where the tea was already steeped and the windows already fogged with breath. The fog didn't lift that day. But neither of them noticed. The next morning, Isla stayed in bed longer than usual. Not from fatigue, but from the rare comfort of knowing that everything could wait. The world wasn't pulling her toward anything. Not today. It was simply asking her to stay. From the other room, she heard Calder turning pages. She smiled. Not because of the sound, but because she recognized the rhythm. He always paused for a second when something moved him, then turned the page gently, like not to disturb it. When she finally joined him, he had a stack of notebooks beside him. Old ones. Some she hadn't seen in years. "This one's yours," he said, handing her a worn, leather-bound volume with a cracked spine. She opened it and found her own handwriting, slanted and looping. Fog doesn't forget. It simply waits. She traced the words with her fingers, then turned to the next page, and the next, and the next. It wasn't just her voice in these pages. It was his. Both had written here, at different times, unknowingly, until the book became a shared conversation they hadn't realized they'd already had. Later, as they sat by the window with tea and silence, Isla asked, "Do you think the fog ever ends?" Calder looked thoughtful, not worried, just quiet. "I think it ends in places we're not meant to follow." She nodded. "But here?" He smiled. "Here it stays with us, or we stay with it." They didn't talk much more after that. They let the afternoon pass with the wind, the kettle, the occasional shuffle of pages. At dusk, Isla placed the old notebook on the shelf, beside the bell, beside the photograph, beside the key labeled tomorrow. Then she turned to Calder and said, "Let's not finish this yet." He nodded. "Let's let it linger." It was a Tuesday. Not that it mattered. Days no longer moved in straight lines. They folded into each other like old blankets, comfortable in their repetition. The fog was thin that morning, just a veil drifting through the tree branches. Birds called softly in the distance, and the tea, as always, was warm. Isla stirred hers absent-mindedly, staring out the window toward the sea. "I used to think I needed to leave," she said suddenly. Calder didn't ask what she meant. He waited. "I thought the world had answers somewhere else," she continued. "Out there. Past the fog. Past this place." She took a sip and smiled faintly. "But maybe it wasn't answers I needed. Just someone to ask the questions with." They walked the path again, this time without needing a reason. The trees had changed subtly, leaves browning at the edges, the moss deeper, the trail familiar enough that their feet seemed to find it without looking. Halfway through, they stopped at the clearing and found another note. This one was carved into a stone at the base of the fence. It read, "You're allowed to stay." The story. No signature, no timestamp. Just that. Isla sat on the ground beside it, letting the sunlight filter through the thinning fog. Calder knelt beside her, brushing pine needles off the stone. "Do you think it's meant for us?" She looked up at him. "I think it's meant for anyone who makes it this far." Later that evening, Calder placed the kettle on the stove. Isla walked past him already holding the cups, and they both laughed, soft, surprised laughter, as they realized they'd both made tea for the other. 2 cups already warm. Neither wasted. The fog came later that day. For most of the morning, the sky had been wide and blue, stretching high over the sea like someone had wiped the slate clean. But then, just after midday, it rolled back in, slow and deliberate, like a guest returning to a house it had once lived in. Isla and Calder met it like an old friend. They decided, without saying it, to hold a small ceremony. Nothing grand, nothing formal, just a moment to honor the quiet and the fact that they were both still here. Calder found a jar of old matches. Isla gathered a few worn candles from the shelves near the stairs. Together, they arranged them on the windowsill in the lantern room, the same room where the fog used to confuse them, used to hide everything beyond the glass. Now they lit it up. 1 candle for every letter they had written, 1 for every version of themselves that had wandered and found its way back. They didn't count. They didn't need to. The glow was enough. Calder looked out at the shifting mist and said, "When I was younger, I thought peace would feel like certainty." Isla leaned against his shoulder. "And now?" He exhaled slowly. "Now I think it feels like a cup of tea you don't remember finishing, like a room that doesn't feel empty even when you're alone." She nodded, or like this. They stayed until the candles burned low, until the fog touched the glass and stayed there, as if it too was resting. There were no letters that day. No new doors, no keys. But as they left the lantern room, Isla paused on the stairs and turned back. "I think this was the letter," she said. And Calder, already smiling, simply replied, "Then I'm glad we opened it." It rained that night. A slow, steady tapping on the roof, like someone writing letters from the sky. The kind of rain that doesn't ask for attention, it simply stays, like a hush over everything. Isla awoke and didn't move. She listened. She counted the spaces between drops. She thought of all the doors they'd opened, literal and otherwise. Glass room, the shed, the letters, each had led them somewhere softer. When morning came, she stepped outside in bare feet again, the porch cool and wet beneath her toes. The fog had thinned, but the air still held it, like a breath not fully released. Calder stood at the edge of the fence, looking not at the sea, but at the ground. There was something there, a letter half buried in the earth. Together they brushed it off. The envelope was sealed with wax. A symbol they didn't recognize, a spiral that turned inward like a fingerprint made of time. They opened it slowly. Inside was no message, just a mirror. Small, oval, the kind you'd find in an old pocketbook. Isla held it up. It showed her reflection, but older, only just. Softer eyes, same mouth. Slight lines at the corners, not from worry, but from smiling. She passed it to Calder. He looked, then turned it over. On the back, scratched faintly into the silver, "This is you still becoming." They placed the mirror on the shelf beside the rest. No ceremony. Just presence. That evening, Calder lit a candle and said, "I don't think the fog's going to take us anywhere else." Isla looked toward the window, where the mist had stilled. "I think it already brought us here." They didn't open another letter that night. They simply sat beside the glow, each holding their own silence. Not heavy, not hollow. Just enough. The fog that morning was lighter than usual. Not absent, just settled. It drifted low along the path like a shawl resting across the shoulders of the land. Soft, familiar, like it too had finally found a place to stay. Isla and Calder didn't speak as they made their tea. They didn't need to. The kettle clicked off just as Calder reached for the cups. And Isla already had the honey in her hand. Small gestures, reflexes born not of habit but of care. They walked to the fence again. No letters today. But that didn't matter anymore. The fence had become a part of their rhythm, a small destination within a day that needed none. They sat, shoulder to shoulder, letting the morning unfold. Calder passed Isla a folded piece of cloth. Inside was the button she'd found weeks ago, the one carved with his initials. He'd polished it, stitched it to a square of linen. A quiet offering. "I wanted you to have something that stayed," he said. She smiled. "You already gave me that." Back at the lighthouse, they opened the drawer where the old letters were kept. Hundreds now. Some were blank, some unread, some only half-written. But each one held something of them. And so slowly they began reading them aloud. One by one. Not in order. Not for meaning. Just to hear the words again. To sit with who they had been and who they were still becoming. At sunset, they sat in the glass room, now clean and clear, filled with warm light. Calder leaned his head back and said, "This feels like a place we had always been." Isla turned to him, eyes soft. "Maybe it is." It rained again, not hard, not loud. Just steady. The kind of rain that made the floorboards sigh with warmth, the kind that blurred the windows and quieted the birds. A soft lullaby drawn out across the hours. Isla and Calder didn't go outside that day. They stayed in the lighthouse, wrapped in blankets drifting from room to room like leaves on a current. In the late morning, Calder found a stack of old postcards tucked in a drawer beneath the staircase. They were faded, edges curled, ink smudged, but still legible. Some bore foreign stamps. Others had none at all. One simply read, "Wish you were here." But it was unsigned. They made a game of it, guessing where each card came from, who might have written it, what they were feeling when the ink touched paper. At some point, Isla stopped guessing and just said, "Maybe they were all from us." Calder nodded, placing the cards in a neat line across the windowsill. Afternoon turned amber. The fog never came in that day. It stayed far out at sea, like it, too, was watching the lighthouse from a distance. There was no letter in the mailbox. No riddle, no mystery. Only the faint sound of the kettle beginning to boil and the creak of the floor as one walked to the stove before the other had to ask. That evening, they sat in the lantern room again. No candles, just dusk. And Isla asked softly, "Do you think this story ends?" Calder thought for a long time before answering. "I think stories don't end," he said. "They just stop needing to be told." She smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "Then I hope this one never needs to stop." The next morning arrived quietly. The lighthouse walls, painted with early golden light, held a kind of hush that made even breathing feel sacred. Isla wandered through the rooms, her fingertips trailing along the edges of tables, doorknobs, photographs. Everything felt awake. Not waiting, just aware. She found Calder in the glass room, not reading or writing, but simply sitting, with eyes closed and palms open in his lap. Listening, maybe, or remembering. "Did you hear it too?" she asked, not knowing what she meant until the words left her. He opened his eyes, smiled softly. "Not with my ears." They made breakfast in silence. Not a cold one, but a shared quiet. The kind that lives in rooms where things are understood, where nothing needs to be said to be felt. The tea was warm. The bread toasted just enough. And as Calder passed her a jar of honey, Isla paused. The label had changed. Same jar, same glass. But the words hand-scrawled across the front now read, "Return sweetly." Neither of them said anything. They just looked at the jar, then at each other. Then quietly, Isla added a spoonful to her cup, stirred once, and nodded. Outside, the fence was dusted with the beginnings of frost. Autumn, reaching its long hand toward the edge of the season. Leaves crunched underfoot as they walked the familiar path. They stood at the clearing, hands in coat pockets, fog thin and rising. There was nothing waiting there. No new letter, no surprise. Just wind in the branches, and the unmistakable feeling that someone else had just been there. Back inside, Calder placed his coat on the hook. Isla turned toward the shelf where the mirror sat. But it was gone. In its place, a folded piece of cloth. Inside, a note, "You know how to see without it now." The days had grown shorter. Not suddenly, not with drama, but with the kind of soft slipping that happens when you aren't paying attention. When the light fades a minute earlier each evening, and you find yourself lighting the lamp not out of need, but out of comfort. Isla and Calder had stopped looking for letters, and yet they still arrived. Sometimes in the curl of steam from a teacup, sometimes in the way the light landed just so on a cracked windowsill, sometimes in the hush between footsteps when the floor held its breath. That morning, Calder didn't come down right away. Isla found him on the rooftop, leaning against the old railing, his coat buttoned halfway, the wind catching the ends of his scarf. He looked peaceful. Not far away, just deeper in thought than usual. She joined him, and together they watched the sea, gray, soft-edged, nearly blending with the sky. After a while, he said, "I think I dreamed something, or remembered it. I'm not sure." She waited. "I was walking this same lighthouse path, but I was younger, maybe 20, maybe less. Everything looked the same, but I didn't know what it was yet." He turned to her, and then I found a letter. Not on paper, not even with words. It was a feeling. He paused, struggling to give it shape. A feeling that said, it's okay not to finish things. Some stories are meant to be lived, not told. They spent that afternoon rearranging the glass room, not out of necessity, but as a kind of ritual. Calder moved a chair near the window, and Isla laid a folded quilt over the back. She took down the notebook they had once shared and placed it open on the small table, the pen beside it. Not to write, just to leave it waiting. That evening, there was a letter in the mailbox, but it was blank. No stamp, no ink, no address. Just soft paper warm from the sun. They brought it inside and left it on the table. Neither tried to write on it. Neither tried to explain it. It was enough just to have it there, something unwritten, something true. As they settled by the fire, Calder said, "Maybe some letters write themselves, not for us, but because of us." Isla nodded, her eyes half closed, voice barely a whisper. "Then maybe we're the story." And for the first time, the fog didn't answer. It simply listened. There were no chores to do that morning. Not because they were done, but because they no longer mattered in the same way. The dust on the shelf would wait. The loose floorboard near the stair would creak again tomorrow. Instead, Ella sat at the kitchen table, letting the sunlight curl through the curtains like it was trying to remember something. Calder placed a steaming cup of tea in front of her. She smiled without needing to say thanks. He already knew. Later, they opened the bottom drawer of the old hutch by the window, the one neither of them had ever thought to open. It had no key, It had never been locked, but somehow it had remained unopened all this time. Inside was a stack of envelopes. Not sealed, not labeled. Just blank, aged by years and dust, as if waiting for someone to give them meaning. Isla picked one up, turned it in her hands, then placed it on the table beside her cup. Calder didn't say anything. He just watched her carefully, softly, like one does when a friend is about to cry, but not from sadness, from recognition. "I used to think the fog was hiding things from me," Isla said, "but maybe it was keeping them safe until I was ready." Calder poured a second cup of tea, this one for himself. "And now?" She looked out the window, where the mist rose like breath from the earth. "Now I think it's always been trying to return me to myself." They sat quietly for a while after that. No letters arrived. No mirrors, no signs. Just the clink of the spoon in the cup. The soft sound of rain returning. And the sense that nothing needed to be fixed. That evening, as they prepared for sleep, Calder paused in the doorway of the lantern room. He turned to Isla and said, I think we could leave if we wanted to." She met his eyes calm and clear. "I know," she replied, "but I don't want to anymore." They stood in silence as the fog wrapped the lighthouse once more. But this time it felt less like weather and more like home. The next morning the world was silver. Not from frost, but from fog so soft it shimmered, catching the pale light like a sigh made visible. Everything was quiet, but not empty. It was the kind of stillness that made space for reflection. Isla stood in the doorway of the lighthouse, wrapped in Calder's old sweater. The sleeves were too long. She let them be. Behind her, the kettle whistled once, then stopped. They sat in the lantern room with their tea, not saying anything, yet exchanging more than words ever could. "I dreamed of my childhood house last night," Calder said finally, "but it looked like this place." "Did it feel like home?" Isla asked. He paused, thinking. It felt like something better than that, like home, if home was allowed to grow. That afternoon they walked the path again, barefoot for no reason other than to feel the earth. The fence hadn't changed. The sea hadn't either. But Calder looked out at the horizon and said, "I don't think we're supposed to leave." Isla reached for his hand. Or maybe we already did. They stood in silence, the way people do when everything they need is already with them. At twilight, they returned to the drawer of envelopes. This time, Isla opened one. Inside was a single line written in tiny script, no punctuation. "You are not lost, you're becoming..." She placed the paper back in the envelope, folded it once, and tucked it into the pocket of her coat. Later that night, Calder lit the last candle on the windowsill. It flickered but did not go out. The room smelled faintly of beeswax, cedar, and the sea. He turned to Isla and said, "We could write one more letter." She smiled and nodded. "But maybe this time," she said, "we write it together." They sat side by side. No rush, no conclusion. Just the slow, quiet act of making something lasting. And outside the fog stayed close, not as a mystery, but as a witness. There had been many letters. Some written, some received, some found tucked in unlikely places, under stones, in the folds of blankets, behind cracked floorboards. But this one felt different. Because this one wasn't meant to go anywhere. It was meant to stay. They wrote it together. By hand. Not to anyone, but for the house itself. A letter addressed to the place that held them. To the window that caught the morning light just right. To the uneven stairs that creaked a little louder on rainy days. To the cup that never chipped, no matter how often it was used. They began simply, "To the quiet that let us breathe." And they continued, passing the pen between them like a shared memory. To the fog that taught us to look closer. To the shelf that knew what to hold. To the time we stopped needing to be anywhere else. When the letter was finished, they didn't sign it. They folded it once, placed it in the blank envelope from days before, and tucked it into the space behind the fireplace stones, somewhere hidden, but safe. Somewhere it could live, not be found, not be read, just exist. That evening, Isla sat by the window and watched the mist press gently against the glass. Calder made a second pot of tea, though neither of them had finished the first. It didn't matter. There was comfort in the making. At some point, Isla whispered, "I think the lighthouse always knew we were coming." Calder nodded slowly, "And I think it knows we're almost ready." She looked down into her cup, watching the leaves settle at the bottom. Ready for what? To stay, or to carry it with us. That night they fell asleep without saying good night. Not because they forgot, but because sleep had become part of the letter too. A final sentence written only in breath. The fog didn't leave. Not that morning or the next. It wrapped the house in a soft silver hush, not to obscure but to hold. A presence, not a veil. And in that stillness, Isla and Calder moved with the slowness of people who understood that something precious was about to shift. They swept the floors, dusted the windowsills, boiled water for no reason at all. Each act not as preparation to leave, but as a gesture of respect, as if saying, "We noticed, we were grateful, we remember." In the lantern room, they sat in their usual chairs, legs curled up, tea cooling in their hands. There were no new letters, only the pages they'd already lived. Calder looked out at the fog. "Do you think it'll lift tomorrow?" Isla didn't answer right away. "I think it already has." They wandered the lighthouse like it was a museum of themselves, touching each space with quiet reverence. The mirror that never returned. The envelope that was never written on. The shelf of letters, some half-opened, some never finished. Each one its own world. Each one a version of them they once needed to be. That afternoon, Calder opened the tiny drawer beneath the stairs again. This time it was empty. Not just cleared, but peaceful. Like it had fulfilled its purpose. He closed it gently. "Maybe we were the ones leaving all the letters," he said. "Maybe we always were," Isla replied. At dusk they didn't light the candle. The soft gray light was enough. They sat together, arms touching, breaths matching. And somewhere in the fog, a breeze moved. Not cold. Not warm. Just present. Like a hand brushing your shoulder, not to guide, but to remind you you're not alone. Later, as they curled into their blankets, Calder whispered, "What if this story never ends?" Isla smiled with her eyes closed. "Then we'll sleep in it." Morning came without surprise. Not bright, not loud. Just present. As if it had been waiting all night in the folds of the blanket, curled gently between Isla's shoulder and Calder's chest. They woke slowly. Together. Neither spoke at first. Not out of solemnity, but because there was nothing more they needed to name. They moved quietly through the lighthouse, each motion tender. Opening shutters, tying hair back, filling the kettle, though neither of them wanted tea. The fog was still there, but it no longer felt like it was between them and the world. It was the world now. A companion, a final page turned softly. In the glass room, they found a letter. Not in the mailbox. Not on the floor. But inside the notebook they had left open days before. The ink was fresh. The handwriting, not quite either of theirs and yet familiar. They read it aloud together. "There is nothing missing. There is no last line. Only what is written now. And now. They closed the notebook, placed it on the windowsill, and didn't need to read it again. Later, they went to the fence, walking barefoot one final time. The ground was warm beneath the fog. At the fence post, a small wooden sign had appeared, hand-carved. "You made it." Not a direction. Not an invitation. Just a truth. They smiled and turned back. Inside the lighthouse, the candle flickered once and went out on its own. No wind, no breath. Just time moving softly. That night they did not say good night. They did not promise tomorrow. They simply rested. back to back, safe, still. And somewhere outside the window, a letter unfolded itself in the wind, its pages blank, open, and endless. Thank you for joining us for Letters Across the Fog. Thank you for joining us in Letters Across the Fog. If this story brought you comfort, stillness, or even just a moment of peace, we're glad you were here. May you rest well tonight, and may the quiet things in your life feel a little closer. If you'd like more stories like this, subscribe and return anytime you need a gentle escape. Until next time, sleep well, dream kindly, and remember not all letters arrive on paper. Sleep Stories, Restless.